friends, today we're going to talk a little bit about swords. And the sword that we're going to talk about today is the arming sword. And the arming sword is a direct descendant of an old Viking sword or a Carolingian sword that you might see anywhere from the 8th to 11th centuries. This type of a sword is basically going to be a secondary weapon. And what I mean by that is this is going to be a weapon that would be carried by a soldier who would also be carrying usually something like a lance. And the lance would be your initial weapon if you were on horseback, for instance if you were a knight, and you would use this weapon as a backup. Often your arming sword would be used in conjunction with a shield. And so you would utilize this with one hand and a shield with the other. What's kind of cool about the arming sword, this one itself is supposedly modeled after a crusader weapon, but this is a one-handed cruciform sword with a pommel. What you have, this is your grip. This right here would be your crossguard, and these are your edges, and they can be made relatively sharp. And you have a point right here. All along here is your fuller, and that is a depression on both sides of the weapon. And it's actually created to make the weapon lighter. This type of a weapon, and I'll demonstrate it a little bit later, is primarily used for hacking. You can stab with it, but the bulk of the damage that you're going to produce is using the weight of the weapon itself to strike a target. And even if that target is wearing armor, it's still going to be quite a devastating blow. One of the things that is going to happen with this weapon is that eventually the tip is going to become more and more tapered. As metallurgy improves and as armor improved, you got to find a way to get this into the creamy nougat inside of your target. And so in order to get through weaker points of someone's armor, these simply became more tapered. And as metallurgy became more advanced, you could make a longer bladed weapon. As a matter of fact, what eventually happens is this weapon slowly becomes what comes to be called a hand-and-a-half sword or a bastard sword. Then eventually a long sword that is utilizes two hands. It's a much longer weapon. Often the user of a two-handed sword, like a long sword, is going to be wearing heavy armor, sometimes plate armor, so they don't need to have a shield. Eventually the long sword is going to become the great sword, a massive two-handed weapon that's taller than a person. And what's interesting is that type of a weapon is going to eventually lead to a desire to have an effective weapon, but one that's not so huge and cumbersome to carry around. Swinging. All right, let's go through some of the parts of this weapon. This rapier has, not unlike the previous sword that we looked at, a pommel and a grip. But instead of having the cross guards, what you have here is a rear quillin and a forward quillin. You have right here side arms. This is a side ring. And over here, what you have is the knuckle bow and a loop guard. All right, so the knuckle bow is here, the loop guard is right here. Yep, that's how it goes. And this is meant to give your hand a little bit more protection. Now, what a lot of people think is that this would be a great way to hook someone else's sword and break it and things like that. And whether or not that was incredibly possible, who knows? But you certainly could redirect a person's blade if it did get caught into here, and you could counter. But what's neat about this is that even though it weighs almost exactly the same as the previous sword, it's pretty quick to use. However, this type of a weapon is not meant necessarily for slashing. It's almost the opposite of the arming sword. The arming sword was certainly more used for hacking. This is more used for stabbing. And we'll show you a little bit about that in just a moment. So, why would you go from this, which, by the way, weighs about 2.5 pounds, right, to this, which weighs only slightly less? If you take a look, it's kind of hard to see, but you look at their relative lengths, and the rapier is longer, right? But they weigh almost exactly the same. Part of the reason that you would shift to using a weapon like this was that normally, if you want to be armed and you want to go around the city streets, having something like this strapped to you is just cumbersome. And what also happened was, in order to be more effective against the new styles of armor, what's going to happen is the swords are going to get longer and longer, and they're just not going to be something that your average person is going to want to carry around. And so what happened was this refinement. Basically the same weight, but longer, and you could carry it on your belt without too much difficulty. This gets a little bit annoying, not gonna lie, but you wore this around unarmored. That's the major difference. This would be something that a civilian would carry versus your sword, an arming sword, that a soldier or knight would carry, right? This is made for civilians. And a civilian is not going to go up against a knight. A civilian is going to go up against another civilian. Hence, they're not going to be armored. And so this type of a weapon is a smart thing to use, because you can carry it, it's not overly burdensome, and when you use it, this defends your hand, and it keeps you far away from your enemy. And so that's one of the major reasons that you have this refinement. A much thinner, sharp blade, not used for hacking and slashing. Yes, you could hack and slash, but primarily it's going to be used to stab. And a stabbing wound with a rapier, while not while it didn't have the knockdown power of getting hit with a great sword or an arming sword or something like that, this type of a weapon can certainly create a wound that is very mortal, and you can't close these wounds up. You're going to get a nice puncture wound, and there's not going to be much that you can do to fix it. A hacking and slashing wound, yeah, you have the concussive effect of getting hit, and a slash or a cut. Cuts can frequently heal. Stabs probably aren't going to. And so these weapons, even though they seem much more refined, are equally deadly. They're also extremely accurate. And if you did have to go against someone who had armor, you could, because you could find the weak points in their armor and take out your opponent. One of the coolest things I learned about studying the rapier is that this weapon, when used against another person similarly armed, involved a great deal of footwork, because the bulk of the attacks that you do involve lunging, and the other individual is going to attempt to obviously parry your blow and counterattack. And what's cool about it is that one of the major goals of fighting with a rapier was to make certain that you had power and leverage over your opponent, meaning you wanted to get this part of your sword onto this part of their sword because you had more power. And that's what's really cool. So if someone came in and attempted to attack, you would attempt to grab the weakest part of their sword with the strongest part of yours so that you could easily move theirs and counter. And so when you see sword fighting in movies, the goal is not to hit another person's sword, which when I was a kid, that's what I thought you did. You just hit someone else's sword. It was looking for a tactical and strategic advantage by finding the weakness of their sword and then taking advantage of that. It's pretty cool.